Hi, we're back, and this is episode 7 of our podcast. It feels like it's kind of flown by. I'm Jenny Schultz-Thomas, your host, and this is Reverend Sarah Rental-Jones, and we are excited to continue this book. David Brooks, How to Know a Person, The Art of Seeing Others Deeply and Being Deeply Seen. We're at the end of the book. We have 3 chapters left. We are looking today at life stories and our ancestors and how our ancestors show up in our lives. So, Sarah, what really hit you about these 2 chapters? Anything that sort of jumps out as, wow, this is what I'm taking away from these really important points that he's making?
Well, I think to speak really broadly, just the importance of story. And even then thinking about our groups, the importance of developing the capacity to tell our stories and to hold other people's stories. I'm really hoping that as we talk today, it'll encourage our village groups to spend some time looking at some of the questions that Brooks brings up that I'm sure that we'll touch on, and really want to hear each other's stories and have these groups be a vessel for storytelling amongst each other.
No, thank you. That's so awesome. I know we've been talking just these past weeks, sharing our own stories, which has been really fun. I think it's a remarkable thing, right, to live this life and to say that our stories are who we are. And Brooks is pointing to both the analytical kind of work of the scientific discovery and psychoanalysis of really what it means to be human. And he brings out so many amazing authors and really prolific thought leaders who are doing this work. But then essentially this whole book, and I think more to the point of storifying life, we have an opportunity to kind of excavate our own stories and look for what's missing. Are we connected to our own story? And when you're asked to really lean into the truth of who you are, and someone's really opening the door for that, and there is capacity, I think you have the opportunity to really say, wow, you know, this is who I am, and then this is what's missing. Or maybe there's a breakage back there somewhere. And right, so this whole life stories, and then who are your ancestors and how they've shaped us. It's this opportunity to not only dig down in the now, but to look back, and both with gratitude and to understand maybe, wow, these are some of the reasons that I show up this way, or some of the questions that I've always had. I'm not sure why. So that's a fun opportunity, I think, for us to point others here and pull out some really cool things that he has to say.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that one of the things I really love about this book overall, and especially these chapters, is the way that we are encouraged to be a little more bold in the way that we approach each other and invite the storytelling and invite people to share with us, and then really understand our responsibility in being someone who can receive the story and can hear it. Even right inside this chapter of life stories, I thought it was such an interesting statement. We don't start conversations because we're bad at predicting how much we'll enjoy them, right? And sometimes we either don't want to bother people or can't tell if they want to talk. And sometimes we might think, well, I don't have time. Let me just get to my next task.
That's right.
But actually, we learn that it's very satisfying to hear other people's stories and to be involved in a meaningful conversation. And that hopefully this is giving us more of the motivation to want to engage that way.
Yeah, I think that's kind of everything, right? It's sort of, we don't know if people really want to hear our stories. And he has a line in here somewhere that we talked earlier about, that when we're so good at being invisible and not telling the full story, like that whole shadow side, if we're so good at that, then we kind of are invisible to ourselves, right? So if you're sharing a story with someone, it might just be, you know, in the carpool line, you're dropping your kids off, and you're like, oh my gosh, you know, good to see you. How was your morning? And you could either say, oh, it's great. How are you? And do the little like cheese smile and go on. Or you can say, oh my gosh, you know, it's been a morning. And really kind of open yourself, right, to being seen. Because part of that takes vulnerability. Well, what if this mom thinks, oh, I have all my stuff together all the time, and now I'm a real person? Well, guess what? She might also be feeling safe to be a real person too, right? But we just don't always give permission to ourselves to fully allow ourselves to be seen, which is, you know, the second part of this title, the art of seeing others deeply and being deeply seen. I keep coming to this in conversations with folks who are in village houses, and then thinking through what is the work to do and what do I see people really leaning into. And I think that's the hardest part of the work, right? You can see other people, but if you're not vulnerable to be seen yourself, you're really seeing them through like invisible lenses. And I think that can be challenging, but it can be so life-changing. You say, it's okay that I wore 2 different color shoes today,
right?
But it's all good, leaning into the fullness of who we are. So he does bring us on a journey, I think, in these chapters around that. What really, if I ask you about the power of your inner voice, because he says he's listening to people in these certain kinds of ways as they tell their stories. He said he's listening hard for a few specific things. And number one is that person's like tone of voice, which is their inner voice. Tell me about inner voice. Are you acquainted with your inner voice, Sarah?
Am I? I have actually worked to get my inner voice to be a little nicer.
Nice.
And have had some occasions where people have pointed out that my inner voice must be, I guess it would probably fall under the ambivalent parent who offers caring criticism, but maybe not always so caring,
Yes.
Maybe just critical. I know we were reviewing the part that talked about speaking to ourselves in the second or even third person. I rarely do that, except sometimes at the gym. I'll be like, come on, Sarah, before I try to lift something heavy or something like that. But yeah, I do feel like I've needed to be more encouraging. And I think sometimes I felt like, oh, don't be too easy on yourself. Right? But when you think about like even a child or a friend or even an animal, how you're going to talk to them, they respond better through encouragement and kindness and positivity than fear, right? So I know I've been working on just being a little more encouraging and, so I guess I'm being vulnerable in sharing that because I feel like I don't want to go too easy on myself. I want to be able to be, excel at things. But putting harsh demands on oneself over and over again doesn't usually actually lead to that good outcome.
No, right? It just makes you feel less compassionate to yourself. And then that leads to more failure, right? If you have these really harsh demands and expectations, not only is it some kind of outcome that you're hoping for, but without seeing yourself fully, you're not, think of a coach. Like you want the coach to encourage you, right? To cross the line or if you're running or whatever. But when you don't, right, we know like harshness like doesn't lead to better outcomes, right? It leads to poor mental health, right? I was an athlete, so that resonates with me. It's like putting harsher demands felt like the only way that you could kind of succeed, right? Pushing your body to the limits, no matter what you were doing. But if you think of it through the lens of, instead of this, I think this integrated way, right? Because these are four different perspectives that these psychologists are talking about, these inner voices. The faithful friend, the ambivalent parent, the proud rival, or the helpless child. But if you see yourself as an integrated person, you can't compartmentalize your inner voice and say, well, I'm going to pick the harsh parent off the shelf, or I'm going to pick the friend. I think we have to see that we are all of those. And if we don't allow ourselves self-compassion and also, a critique of self that you might evaluate, then you can be the friend, right, that you are also hoping that you are to yourself. So much of it is not compartmentalizing, I think, who we are, but integrating that inner voice so that it also becomes like the outer voice.
Definitely.
How we show up in the world with others.
Yeah, because I think sometimes even if we are kind outwardly, when we're harsh inside, we can be kind of disguising some judgmentalism that does sometimes come out. Especially when we might not be at our best. And so cultivating the kindness that we want to offer others and having it be kind of like a through line instead of being kind of one external and one internal. That makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah. How about you? Do you resonate with this inner voice that he talks about?
Yeah. I think I was thinking about like literature and growing up, how I loved to read, and I loved to find, those inner voices would sort of, if I was feeling a certain way, I would pick up a certain book. I might have read this book like 7 times, right? but you pick up that same story because you might not at that moment be able to articulate or dive into your own emotions, probably for fear of vulnerability or like, I need to hide this part of myself, but I'm going to dive into this expression, right? And it was this outlet, so in reading, and I love how he uses this whole like tone of voice and who's the hero and what's the plot and who are the characters, because I think I did sort of build my own infrastructure for mentally escaping from some of the difficulties to find my own place in a story that was already lived, right? And I think that whole hero's journey, right? If you think of Joseph Campbell or, we do this, we other people in a way that's either they're the hero or the villain, right? And we do that in general. We polarize and we are in that place now, right? In our society. But instead of it just being, either or, I think that whole work of integration and finding your inner voice is knowing that you play different roles in your life story, right? If you know who you are, the through line is who am I, right? Who am I in this story? Who am I in my own story? Then you kind of know if you're not the hero, well, what would a hero look like? If you're having difficulty, well, what would a hero look like in this story? Or maybe there's pain and he talks about this, like a mother who doesn't share like the painful sides of the story. And so the children are kind of bereft when there's difficulty looking back. If you leave out the pain, you don't really know who might be the person, riding in to save the day. You don't really know how 3 or 4 children could work together to create and solve solutions, right? And so I think for me, this was a fun, kind of experiment of, wow, I think I did some of that journeying through literature in my own way, but then trying to find a true self. You think you can write your own story. And then sort of, wow, this is the role I typically play. And then this is the role that I invite others to play as a true self when they're telling their own stories. So that was a fun little dive for me in there.
Yeah. Well, and I really appreciated just the way that we're reminded that our lives aren't linear. And so, we kind of think about this through line, but also that, what makes us interesting is some of the diversions off of the path that we thought we would have. And even if in looking back, we tell our story in a way that sounds linear, we all know that we have these little side quests, I guess you'd say, today, to be able to kind of normalize those and let people know that they are part of life, these unexpected things that can happen to us. Like he says at the bottom of 223, the summary might be, I decided to become a doctor and pursued my dreams, but then there's this breaks, discontinuities, false starts, that can happen, and one could still end up being a doctor, but it's not necessarily just this like straight line up the mountain like we sometimes think it would be.
Yeah, that's so great. And, even the rare person, he said, who can say, I just caught a wave and wrote it, and then I caught another wave and wrote it. We were talking earlier about life and, different places. And I think that speaks to kind of how we are culturally assimilated, or we cultivate cultural experiences in our own homes, in our own towns, even our churches, that say, are we supposed to be on this particular journey? Right? I think in the West, in our really, the exceptionalist kind of intellectual communities that we build, that you should be doing X, Y, Z as a child, we don't really make space for a wave to even come along, right? So you can't catch a wave if you can't even see the ocean, right? Because you're supposed to be bricklaying, boom, 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 boom. You're supposed to get from here to here. And so I think he talks later about tight and loose cultures, but how we definitely in the United States of America, we're a loose culture, but it's more about our individualistic kind of focus, right, on ego and our own opportunity to manifest destiny kind of thing. But if you have this opportunity to say, I have agency and I understand who I am in my story, then when I do take, maybe a step not that's going straight up the ladder, but over here, I know how to find a way back if that is indeed my goal. But this divergent road that I've taken can also have meaning, right, and value. And I can see even if there's a mistake in there, it's still a part of who I am. It doesn't have to be like invisible in my life narrative, because we all take more than one of those divergent paths, So if you have a bunch of steps that are just shame-filled, and invisible. You know, no matter, we have a lot of broken adults who are not sure what their real story is because you tell a false story for so long.
Right.
Sort of like, wow, there's probably more pain in there than anything.
Right. Well, and how does our interaction with other people impact this? And, you know, I was really struck by this story right toward the end of the chapter when he's talking about visiting a friend who was about a week away from dying of cancer. And he says he talked regretfully about a time when he had held an important job and how it had made him crueler to the people around him. That, you know, we can sometimes get so caught up in what we think is important. And if that causes us to lose sight of the way that we interact with other people, you know, maybe being able to learn from stories like this, which fortunately this friend was able to go back and transform narratively and see things to be grateful for instead of this feeling of cruelty that he also remembered of himself. But being able to say, like, how do I want to treat people along the way, that our goals, whether they're career-wise or different achievements, that they don't dominate and make us so single-mindedly focused on those that we're not as kind and loving as we want to be.
I know. I mean, it kind of breaks my heart a little bit in this work that we do, right? Journeying with people on their life journey, maybe sitting at the bedside and hearing, you know, a lot of stories about regret, or even angst about, you know, if I only had more time than this. You know, I think the real invitation, like, that life is this amazing gift, is that there's always an opportunity, right, to kind of unlearn and relearn. I mean, this quote he says about that Niebuhr wrote, we understand what we remember what we forget, make familiar what had before seemed alien. And that's about, like, living with honesty and compassion. And so understanding what we remember and remembering what we forgot. I mean, I hope that we can understand that we remember that from the very beginning, we are beings that have the capacity for compassion, right? And that unlearning is so much of society as we rear children, and our society kind of has this, you know, at any given decade or 100 years, a way of, you know, teaching children and formulating, like, little adults, that what we can remember is that our number one call is to see the human, right, and the sacred in another. And so if we can go back there, even at the end of the road, I mean, there's never a moment that's too late. There's maybe regret and I wish I had. But if you can see with eyes of compassion and know that we are interconnected, right, that my being is tied up in yours and the sacred story can only be lived when we both see the humanness in the other, then we do have the opportunity to change and be transformed.
That makes me think about the story that he tells about Zora Neale Hurston in the chapter, How Do Your Ancestors Show Up in Your Life. He really tells a lot of her biography and the way that she was raised and some of the difficulty that she had with her father. The phrase that I keep thinking of when I think of her is the indomitability of the human spirit and how tenacious she was in living out what she really felt that she was here on earth to do.
I know, it was really powerful listening to her and then looking at that tenacity which carried her through, right, as a writer. Almost this form of resistance early on was her identification, and then she used that really to unpack and then create a bridge, right, between people and her people, her community. I loved her story about being on Joe Clark's porch. She said she really wasn't allowed to hang around the porch because they were talking about things that were not for little girls' ears, right? But she did, and she said there were no discrete nuances of life on Joe Clark's porch. There was open kindness, anger, hate, love, envy, and its kinfolks, but all emotions were naked and nakedly arrived at. Right? I mean, you could tell for her, those experiences really cemented in what it meant to truly live, right? Whether it was fully in anger or fully in lust or any of those things, what happened on that porch really did shape who she would become as a great storyteller. Yeah, so I think we all can learn a lot from the overhearing of conversations, right? Just like overhearing the gospel in homiletics. We learn a lot of stories before we even know what they're about, right? Maybe a story and there's a deeper theology. And then we, the rest of our lives is unpacking what's at the heart of that, who, and why does it matter?
That's right. That's right. And another thing that her story leads us into is place, right? Thinking about the sacredness of place. And, I know one of the questions we were wanting to encourage the groups to talk about, based on what Brooks is sharing here about his own upbringing in New York, is to think about our senses of place. He uses this line, "I may never live in New York again, but I'll never be able to completely live anywhere else." And so it got me thinking about, the question, where do you feel you've completely lived? And that can also have to do with having a sense of home and sacred roots inside of us that we take with us when we go to different places. Or it can really be a resonance with a place and a sense of belonging to the earth in a certain place, or maybe just feeling really at home there.
I know, it's so powerful. I love this theology of place. When I was doing my doctoral work, it's one of the questions I was teetering on. Oh, do I really want to just do a theology of place? Probably because almost the antithesis of like what we're seeing come out in this work and in these questions, I did not have a place, really, a lot of places. My family moved a lot. And so I was always defining myself by not having a place, right? And so you move, you don't have the same people, you don't have the same teachers, you don't have the same school, you don't have the same geographical landscape, right? But without having a place, then home became something else, rooted in people or experiences, or the way that I articulated a narrative, right? And created this kind of scaffolding for my own sacred place based on little pieces of the world that was in everyone, right? It's like the mountains, the rivers, they tell a deep story. The people who inhabit those lands, so I think this is this is really something to lean into in these groups in our village houses, because we all have a story that's connected to either the place, or we respond to a place that wasn't there. Maybe your home wasn't your safe place. Maybe, the story that you have told and then the shadow story, right, need to be integrated. And maybe she talks about artists, going back to their childhood homes as a source of spiritual nourishment in search of explanations for why they are as they are. I mean, that can be such a great pilgrimage, right, that we all take, uncovering pieces that we didn't even know we needed to learn about.
Yeah, I think that there's so much interest and accessibility in being able to find out who we are with ancestry.com and things like that. I know I was surprised doing that research to find that there had been this time spent in Switzerland with both my parents' sides of the family. And so it was well, are we Swiss? But actually we're still German, but we spend time in Switzerland. But I think, actually, if I were to do a pilgrimage and go to those places, it would be interesting to kind of have a timeline too for how long was spent in each place and what was the reason. It's sort of thinking about what led us on our paths to get to where we are, and some of the reasons that we would leave one place and go to another, and how that incorporates our ancestors into our story, because maybe they made different decisions, whether for freedom, whether for religious reasons or political reasons, safety reasons, a sense of adventure, whatever the case was. Sometimes not all great either, with colonization, but just being able to look back at that and see what has made us who we are and how we got to where we are today.
Yeah. He points to this, what you're talking about, this kind of pilgrimage. Edmund Burke once wrote that people will not look forward to posterity who never look back to their ancestors. I think we all have this kind of deep desire to look forward and to know where we're going, but understanding who has marched, before you, whose feet and footsteps are you walking in. It kind of unleashes a freedom, right, to both choose with agency how and why you're walking forward, but also I think, frees some of the questions that can hold us back. We have unanswered questions about our families, or I remember doing work on the northern slave trade and the history of slavery in the North, and working with different congregations in different states, answering these questions, and people who thought that their ancestors were not involved in the slave trade, which is a big, misconception about the North, started really wanting to dive in and understand their own kind of lineage and connectedness. And then I think it felt sort of like, now I can draw a line in the sand and say, I can accept this and name this, and I'm going to work, otherwise, so that this doesn't happen. But knowing that we're connected, and knowing sometimes what those connections to our ancestors have done to shape our own perspectives in the world, or the reasons that we ask or don't ask questions. I mean, that can be powerful. It's in what you're talking about. I mean, think of immigration in our own country. I mean, most of our ancestors, all of our ancestors, right, were immigrants to this country at some point. Some by choice and others enslaved, right? And so how we understand that, and then how little it comes to bear on some of the decisions that we make in this country politically, or about who can come in or who can't. I mean, all of these things, understanding who we are connected to in our past, gives us the freedom to both have ownership and then take responsibility, right, for the present and the future, which I think is upon all of us. Yes,
absolutely. And I think, one of the things I really liked that he pointed out about Hurston and her writing, I love this line on page 235. He says, Hurston defied the lazy way people today classify others according to their group. So I think sometimes, we can look back and we can see those trends in our culture and how we've moved to where we are, but we can also learn the specificity of our particular families and how we are a part of a group, and at the same time, like he says, how do I see a person as part of their group, and how at the same time do I see them as a never to be repeated, unique individual, bringing their own unique mind and viewpoint. And how important that is to being able to be exactly who we are, while knowing that we're always shaped and informed by these wider forces, but we also are these, fearfully and wonderfully made creatures that God has shaped.
Yeah, that's powerful, especially in connection to what sometimes the unexamined eye, right, or the unconscious bias, or all the things that kind of are, I think, really involved in the way that our students are being shaped right now, especially in K-12, with profiling, right, without bringing those kinds of things into the classroom, or revealing the ways that we do, like racial profiling or those kinds of things. If you're seeing someone as a part of a group, the one side of that is the stereotypical lens through which every person who looks like this person must be X, right? When you free yourself to see someone and deeply see them as their unique, beautiful person, right? Then you understand, well, I'm seeing them through a lens where they're now part of my group, right? Again, we talked about this like Ubuntu. We are actually connected beyond the colors of our skin or the color of our eyes, but something I can regroup, right? Now we are human first and not othered first. I think that's also an opportunity. When we start to do this work, we realize that other things are inviting us to take steps forward in freeing the mind from what we have generally sought out as othering or differentiating, so that we might, right, ego first. He's always pointing these things out to me that are not really in the book, but that I think his work is so prolific, and he's talked to so many people as a journalist, and has woven together this narrative that allows us to both be seen, talk about our own personal stories, and then reveal the things that we have yet, right, to do. And I don't know about you all who are doing and reading this book in your village houses, but hopefully there are things tangentially related to this work that also invite you to explore your inner self. The end of this book is really about cultures, right? And the Eastern and the Western hemispheres, and how we have geographically across the ages made similar choices. And we continue to reify those choices based on our geography. What did you think about this part, Sarah?
I thought this was just absolutely fascinating. This was new to me, to know about, kind of starting on page 241, the different migration patterns of people from Europe into various parts of especially the East Coast, and how those the trends in their culture and some of the traits. It's sort of, I know we're kind of like ping-ponging back and forth between the individual and the group, but this helps to understand the individual better when we know about some of the different variations in the culture, like the very particular European culture of the people, and even different parts of England, and how when they settled in these various parts of the United States, what is now the United States, these legacies live on to this day in some of the ways in which people make choices, how they vote, how they appreciate or don't the military, what their view of education is. There's just so many different factors that are informed by the history and the origination of their people.
Yeah, it is fascinating, and it's almost, you kind of read this and you think, really, right? Because to know that we're still like living in these different iterations of choices that we've made and still coming to bear on our elections, that was really, because we're in an election year. He said, throughout American history, that New England states have tended to vote one way, the Appalachian states have tended to vote the opposite way, and the electoral maps look pretty much the same. And then he's talking about, populism, and these candidates did well in southern and midwestern states. And then how the only difference in 1896 with William Jennings Bryan, and then who was a Democrat then, and now 2020 with Donald Trump, who's a Republican. Like, look how some of the values, right, have stayed similar. But then when, be it identity politics or just the over stereotypical nature of what we do in the West, right, with our thoughts and ideas, we are still in this place of intense control. And right, so the West has this loose culture, but so much of that loose culture is about individualistic agency and control versus, in these more collectivism countries in the world, it's less about identity individually and more about a collective group identifying with needs-based associations. And so, not to say that we're in a bad place, it's just kind of fascinating to see that we're in this little microcosm in the world and thinking that so much has changed. And yet you can draw a line almost like, stair-stepping and then a circle, and we're kind of right back to the same place. So it means that, where we've come from is, where we're going.
Yeah.
It might always look similar.
That is so true. And I don't know what to make of it sometimes. It feels comforting in a way, and it feels discouraging in a way to know that, we are so shaped by all of these factors that we might think that we're free from. We think that we have so much self-agency, and yet we have these pulls on our decision-making and on even the way we raise our children, the expectations that we have for our lives, that they're so influenced by all of these factors that it does make sense as you think back generationally, generation upon generation, how we've been shaped. But I think sometimes we like to think that we have a lot more autonomy than perhaps we do.
Than we do. I know, it's sort of this like joke. I mean, I'm not, thinking about theology and about Calvinism and Arminianism, this whole, I've always loved that joke, well, I don't believe that we're puppets on a string, and God is up there, with a magic wand. But sometimes you think about if those bigger questions, right, have always been a part of human civilization and our consciousness. With enlightenment, we continue to take these steps forward, but we kind of have the same map, right? And we're just like moving the pieces around. Well, then what? I think that points to the importance of story, because story is transformative, right? Pain, when shared, vulnerability, when you're open and breaking open, there is real change in the condition of that one human being's experience on this planet. So maybe some things are staying the same, but I hope that we as humans, right, in our society, in our city, in our church, in our families, in our homes, like we can start to really listen to each other's stories, really see the pain and the beauty, and know that we can take one faithful step forward, right? And that's basically knowing and loving yourself in a way that allows you to know and love others. So there's a lot to learn, but I think if it's one thing that I take away from this work, it's that there is so much power when human beings can really see and listen and then have a collective story, right? My worth and my identity and my prosperity in this world is caught up in yours. And if it's not somebody I know, it's somebody the world has othered, well, albeit, right, we are interconnected. What do you think? What are you taking away from this chapter or these parts of the book, Sarah?
Yeah, I think I'm taking away just sort of this ongoing dialogue between the individual and the collective and the interplay thereof. Both the way that we're shaped by our communities and our legacies, those who came before us, and the way that we are individuals. And I do really, really love the emphasis on story. I love to hear people's stories. I love to hear organization stories, kind of the origin story of how did you form, and then what happened, what are some of the diversions along the way, some of the even missteps or just wild and unpredictable moments in an organization's history, whether it's a church or another organization or institution, and really love the questions that we're left with toward the end of this chapter, which I think will be great questions for our groups to discuss amongst themselves. You probably wouldn't get past the first couple questions, but taking a look at these that go from the bottom of 244 to 245 and just so many opportunities to share of ourselves with each other, and then to also receive what others are sharing with us.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think that's great. I mean, we hope that you will at least invite each other to share stories this week when you're sitting around the table. Maybe one that feels like it's lifting off the page in this chapter. And these chapters is kind of this deep story of where is home? And if where is home is a hard question to answer, what makes up the pieces of a place you feel safe, right? Where you have completely lived or completely felt at home. And then share those stories. I'm going to leave you this quote that he shares at the bottom, at the end of the chapter, 245. You live through time, that little piece of time that is yours. The novelist Robert Penn Warren wrote, but that piece of time is not only your own life, it is the summing up of all the other lives that are simultaneous within yours. What you are is an expression of history. There you have it, friends. This is It Takes a Village, and we hope that you are joining your village this week, whether that's your home, your children, your families, or your village house. But we'll see you next week to talk about wisdom. So have a great one.